Welcome to this week's COVID-19 Shared Mobility Briefing. I'm Venkatesh Gopal, and I handle business development and partnerships at MoveMe. Today's focus is electric shared mobility, and we are lucky to be joined by two of the best EV industry experts. James Carter, Principal Consultant at Vision Mobility. His authority on electric vehicles and EV mobility is very well known. Thank you for joining us, James.
Thank you for having me here today.
And we are joined by Dermot Hikish, launch architect at Rightsil, one of the top technology providers globally in shared mobility. Thank you, Dermot.
Great to be here.
So, kicking off the session, during the past few months of the lockdown, shared mobility space has seen a lot of challenges, but the time hasn't been without silver linings, so to speak. The urban traffic congestion has relaxed, the air quality has improved. Speaking of urban air quality, everyone seems to be talking about electrification. So, diving deeper into the EV discussion, how has the pandemic affected electrification of transportation, particularly in shared mobility? Let's start with you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Venkatesh. I think one of the things that's been really interesting is when you step back and have a look at the automotive industry as a whole. And what we saw was the industry went through some very, very big dips. Sales off up to 50 to 70%. But what we saw at the same time is that while EVs generally were affected as well, they weren't affected as much. So we actually started to see market share of EVs, started to climb. And there was a couple of reasons for this. One is EVs tend to be in a backlog of supply in some ways, so that you place your order, you wait for it to come through, and then the vehicle arrives. So what we saw happening was that these EVs were still arriving, while people who are used to buying IC vehicles would typically go to the dealer and buy. But that wasn't happening, but these supply, these EVs were still coming in. So from an industry point of view, we saw that market share rise. But I think there was as you mentioned, there was a bit more of a growing consciousness and an awareness of the public of why the EVs are important. We saw people just not drive to work. They were in place at home. The traffic was vastly reduced. We saw air quality in cities right around the world drastically improved, and we had that here in Toronto as well. And people were starting to say, well, look, why can't it always be like this? It's great. And especially in those cities that are more polluted. I think this growing consciousness surrounding what EVs can do in terms of not only reducing CO2 levels, but the real practical aspects that you can see, and that's smog. I think when we have a look at a little bit of a further overview of electrification too, we've also seen that start to grow also in heavy duty as well, with trucks and buses, and even right down to micromobility levels as well. So I think from electrification, this has been a really important time for EVs.
Great. Dermot, we heard what James introduced EVs and what the challenges and what the changes were. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to what James is sharing on the EV infrastructure side, we've been fortunate that the deployment of new charging stations and the like hasn't really slowed down, at least in the short term. The reason being, it is a construction project, so the majority of construction, at least here in North America, has been deemed an essential service. And the ability to do the work from safe distances from one another has been able to be within the minimum compliance levels. So that's been really helpful. At the end of the day, adding a charger into a public space, whether it's in a city or the side of a motorway or highway, involves planning and permitting and the like. So those projects we've seen are still on track, which is helpful for shared mobility and car share and car rental operators that are deploying electric and having users that are going further afield. Deployment-wise for us, we have gig car share that's run by AAA here in Northern California. Their Sacramento operation, for instance, wasn't launched with the 260 Chevy Bolts. until there was a minimum viable capacity of EV charging generation. So similarly, any of our other projects that are EV focused, typically the charging infrastructure is that first step before a deployment of a fleet even happens. Most recently, we added 500 car EV fleet of Renault Zoes in Paris just in last month, which is rather exciting. That project was delayed, I want to say maybe 6 to 8 weeks while the pandemic was at its peak in France and in Spain, which it was actually helpful to button down a few of the critical launch needs. And with Ziti's focus during that time, they repositioned a great deal of their fleet towards supporting the healthcare industry where the need was greatest. So we're happy to report that the Paris launch went really well for us. Usage is up and meeting our initial KPIs, so everyone's pretty positive on being able to deploy during an uncertain time like this.
Oh, that's great news.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned about charging infrastructure. So I understand when you come to shared mobility, anyways, the car is shared. But then talking about specifically the chargers, when do you see that that's the way you've approached deploying charging infrastructure or giving procedures how to access those to your users? Has that been affected due to the post-pandemic changes, Dermot?
Certainly, there in certain areas there has been some changes that have taken effect. Each of our partners is a little different in their approach within managing the EV fleet. So, for instance, in Ziti's case with the EV fleet there, both in Madrid and in Paris, they do all their charging themselves. So enacting employee policies for safe charging and safe cleaning approaches for these vehicles is really focused on it. It's an internal centric approach, whereas in, say, GIG's case in Sacramento, or our partners with AES Corporation that have Motor Go in Indianapolis and in Arlington, Virginia, they are informing their users on how to safely charge or operate the vehicles. And with public charging infrastructure, whether it's ChargePoint or Electrify America's network, there's a lot more signage and guidance that's showing up on those public charging stations. I think what's really interesting, though, within that is, when you draw a comparison to the rate of use of a person's hand touching an electric vehicle charger in the public space, say it's an L2 or even a DC fast charger, the number of people that actually touch that and the length of time that they're holding on to that handle is so small compared to what you see at the gas pump, which is being used every 5 to 10 minutes. And also like looking at the door of a grocery store or something else that you might walk into. So the risk exposure is certainly less than what you'd see in the fossil fuel industry. And so that's been helpful to see if there's been any dramatic approaches taken to managing the health risks at, say, your local gas station, which has a much higher risk profile than what you'd see in a public charging space right now.
Great.
Dermot, yeah, I think that's a big one. I think even for a lot of your customers that may not even have to even plug in that EV as well, because you have some back-end operations that are supporting that. They don't even ever have to touch it during a car share operation. So that's from I guess as you said, the risk profile is very low on shared electric vehicles, and I think even on owned electric vehicles where a lot of people just use their home charger anyway, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, that's the other factor too. You're not really pumping gas into your ICE car at home. You're only doing that at a public place, whereas with EVs, even if you're subscribing onto an EV or renting one for, say, a couple of days, you might be using your own plug at home to top it up. So you're not getting into the public domain as much, which is helpful.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're going to see, the nanoseptic technology and that sort of stuff that's appearing on some of the scooter companies, like Wheels, for instance. I think Voy has done a little bit there. That to me makes sense with that approach, given that you're holding on to that handle for such a long period of time with that ride, and typically you might be gripping it pretty hard. In any case, I love riding jump bikes here in San Francisco. I would, during the pandemic, I still rode them on occasion, but I wore gloves and sanitized the hands after I got off the ride to my destination. What I've also found really interesting, we're just learning so much about how to be safer out there and where the highest risk areas are. And I found a really good article in CBC, I think it was last week, that was over 200 scientists working with the WHO that was really explaining the risk profile of contracting COVID-19 and how much more it is airborne versus potential transmission via the hand and then to the mouth. Apparently, we don't have a confirmed case that's been a hand touching transmission, whereas the cases that we can confirm are typically airborne, where it's HVAC systems, indoor restaurants, the like, or person to person transmission. The focus there with, say, Uber's policy of leaving windows open at least 3 inches while you're driving, face masks mandatory, those sort of things go a huge way versus us like really diving into, say, like, okay, how often do you need to have the public charger plugged in and cleaned, or how much more should you focus on that versus focusing on having your users really make sure that if they are with strangers in a vehicle, get that mask on and leave the window open.
Agreed. Then my next question was on the curbside charging. So I think since there's so much riding over the curbside charging infrastructure being there for the public, especially, which will be an incentive for shared mobility operators to go electric, does the pandemic make matters worse for cities to adopt these curbside chargers? Probably not.
I don't think that the pandemic itself has any particular rub off per se. Really, I can only think of positive outcomes for the adoption of electric chargers in cities, and that being, some of the things that Dermot was mentioning before, like, touching of gasoline and diesel pump infrastructure, obviously reduced, and, obviously the benefit to emissions. Obviously, though, and I think a couple of the things that we need to bear in mind, and rideshare operators are very, very keenly aware of this, is, where do you put the chargers, and do they take up parking spaces and things like that? That they are, potential issues, and the cities have to figure out how to work around that. We certainly saw that in some downtown or inner suburbs in Toronto with car sharing, people not happy that their car park was taken up, but not exactly realizing that shared mobility, if everyone adopted it, would actually benefit them substantially and reduce the amount of parked cars on there. And I think in some ways that's going to happen with EV charging as well.
Yeah, and from my own experience, I was fortunate to work with the city of Sacramento when they designed and implemented their free flow one-way car share city policy, and when they were doing that, they were in partnership with Electrify America and deemed the green city, and so they were really focusing on electrification of vehicles and how do we actually get this to more people in the community of Sacramento, and curbside charging was a big component of that, for whether it was Zipcar to lease a space downtown or in other parts of the city that were high traffic, so they could do, say, round trip electric vehicles, scheduled rentals, or the like. Policy wise, I found it really interesting and inspiring that they actually provided a 50% discount on permitting fees or annual fees for electric vehicles versus ICE vehicles. I thought it was really market leading, and we're hopeful to see a number of other places do that. I think in the charging spot as it relates to curbside and city management, I think there's two areas that we're going to see, I think, a bigger uptick in the decision making. One is, the cities are really in a tight spot financially right now. Just like the amount of revenue that they're not getting with everything shut down. And beyond, probably taxes not being paid and the like. So every spot that they want to consider for a charging location over, say, a parking meter, they really need to see, is it going to recover at a minimum the cost that they get from that parking meter, assuming it's taking over a commercial parking space, which often it will because it's higher traffic. The other part, and this is a really inspiring part for I think all of us on this call, is just seeing cities like Milan and the other places like that are really pushing forward with aggressive bike lanes and fantastic new networks to move more people along the space. And that really is roadside. It's roads, but it's also curbside. And so that decision making of, maybe we're talking about putting an EV charging hub in this specific location for this city, but now it's being deemed for a bike lane. And how do those two needs interact? How do we go around making new plans given the prioritization, and rightfully so, for more dense, more efficient, and cleaner transportation, such as being enabled by e-bikes and bicycles and the like.
Dermot, I'm definitely with you. I like cycling a lot, more recreational and often, mountain biking side. But, one of the things about my area that I wish there was better cycling facilities on the street, so that we can actually, instead of taking our bike to do recreational riding, which is great, but I want to be able to do more commuting or more errands and things like that. And right now I'm still is it safe? Is what's going to happen with these cars around us? And I think Toronto, City of Toronto as well, has recently introduced a whole bunch more bike lanes, and I think that's really, really helpful as well. And it's really encouraging to see a whole bunch of other cities actually block streets off and say, hey, you know what? This is no more cars. We're just going to do bikes and perhaps really small bike-like vehicles. So I think that's a really, really positive move that's come out of COVID.
Yeah, and definitely. Talking of Milan, I love how the city has given like a sort of an incentive money pool for users to use just sustainable transportation. You cannot use that amount given by the government to you for your own cars. So that definitely pushes people to use shared mobility and definitely gives a chance to deploy charging stations and all that for shared mobility. And talking about, James, your point of cities reallocating existing roads now post-COVID, yes, I think that's totally a trend that we are seeing. City of Vancouver just allocated about 11% of the roads for biking and walking after amazing. The COVID. So that's something new that's come up over and above what was already planned as part of the 2040 plan. So that's really encouraging.
Yeah. I think the other point with electrification too is just the rapid growth of e-bikes that we've seen, right around the world. Wow. Bikes have obviously taken off as well, and every bike shop's charging a premium on their bikes. But even e-bikes too, sales are dramatically up. They're so fun to ride. You can go so much further. They're such a great device. What I'm hoping as we move forward is that the price of e-bikes does come down a little bit. They're still a bit expensive to buy, but from a shared mobility point of view, and I remember using Jump Bike in Washington when I was down there, and they were relatively cheap. In fact, they were cheaper than a scooter and so much better to ride that I really enjoyed taking that as a form of transportation.
Definitely.
Yeah, and with the micro-mobility side too, which I've been a big fan of seeing with the improvement of their products, is the swappable batteries. And we were hoping to see that within the automotive sector. It's not going that direction. But we, for instance, have been working with Avoy over in Europe, which are located in 40 cities. They shut down a lot during the pandemic. I think they're back open in 30 of those. And they just reported today their June results and first month of actual profitability based on EBITDA, which is a huge milestone. And we're very happy for them. They're using our fleet operations tool in a number of cities to help with their operational efficiencies, including swapping out those batteries. What they've found with the cities that they've already added in the scooters that have swappable batteries is, they're getting a 50% reduction in operational costs and the like, just by being able to change batteries, have a hub to charge all these things, rather than having to, say, have a really decentralized network to charge across the city. Being able to create a hub and spoke model has been really helpful. And that's kind of where I don't think we're going to get to swappable batteries for vehicles. James, you might know something that I haven't heard on that end, but with DC fast charging coming along, that really to me is where we'll see a future for more efficient operational management versus, say, putting a charger on every corner. I mean, that the charger on every corner concept is helpful. It can help people feel secure with their range anxiety that they might be experiencing currently. That's quickly going away given the new generation of vehicles coming out with longer range and also DC fast charge capabilities, which could be replacing or complementing a lot of these gas station locations. Operationally for us, our partners, when they need to recharge a number of their fleet vehicles, say they're doing it at night while most of us are sleeping and not using the vehicles. If there's one location that has only a single charger within 2 blocks of them, and there's another location that has 5 or 6 chargers, and it's 6 blocks from them, they're more likely to go to the location with multiple chargers, just to be able to manage more vehicles, have a higher likelihood that someone's not blocking that charger, for instance, and just being able to get that done.
Dermot, in terms of your viewpoint of battery swapping and I think one of the key advantages that micromobility has and smaller mobility has is simply that those batteries are, movable by people, so you can just lift them out and swap them. Obviously you can't do that with cars and trucks, and to do it well, you need lots of infrastructure, and that's expensive. I think one of the other ones that's been successful pre-COVID is Gogoro in Taiwan, where we've seen, the scooters being owned, but the batteries haven't been, and them, interchanging the batteries at corner stores, and simply for the reasons that Dermot mentioned, they're transportable. And I think applying that way of thinking, onto micromobility and particularly e-bikes is a really terrific, move forward.
Yeah, it seems like electrification of shared mobility would definitely be something to talk about, and many things that would be positive for electrification going forward. So finally, something that I wanted to know from both of you guys, what changes do you expect to see going forward, if you wanted to put it in a couple of sentences each?
I'll let Dermot go first.
Good question. Changes we'll see going forward. I think we're gonna see more pivoting as we learn more. I think we're working predominantly in Europe and North America, and the difference in approaches and the difference in stages of getting through the pandemic has really dictated how quickly some operators and some of the discussions we're having as far as new markets to expand or new product lines, as well as what is the overall risk of keeping an operation going, for instance. I think that human habits form pretty quickly, and I think we've all become somewhat germophobic during this time. I know I think we all wash our hands significantly more. We all think about the doorknob now. And that wasn't happening for me back in December. And so I think with that, I don't think that's going to go quickly. So the procedures that are being put in right now, Evo, for instance, is, I think, doubled down on the number of times they clean vehicles, and they've done a bunch of stuff there in Vancouver to really get further ahead of as far as maintaining a very safe fleet for their users. But the other habit that we're also seeing is, people now want a vehicle for longer. Instead of just taking it for an hour or two, they're like, look, I'm going to take it overnight, and I might only use it almost the same amount of time, but at least it's my vehicle. I can do some other things with it and hold on to it. So we've had a number of operators now add on longer rental periods at a discount, or even subscriptions to a monthly and a discounted rate for hourly or daily rates. And we even have a new customer that has now asked to remove the maximum cap rental which was, I think was set at 30 days. They now want it at 60 days. You know, it's summertime, so people are actually saying, I don't want to own a car, but I'd really benefit from just having a car for the next 60 days because it is summer, and I want myself and my family to be contained in one mobility option.
Yep. Over to you, James.
Yeah, absolutely. Just echo obviously what Dermot is saying there. In terms of electrification, I really think the changes that we've seen already will just continue at a much faster pace. And I think what we've seen is COVID being almost an accelerator. It's almost been like a turbo boost function for where the market is, if that makes sense. And so I think it's almost like an awakening in some ways is happening right across the board for electrification, and I really think we'll see much faster rollout. Even in the market terms, we've seen there being a very significant increase in the amount of investment and the amount and demand by investors for clean mobility and clean electrification. We've seen Tesla's numbers, obviously, stock prices go up very dramatically. Nikola enter in with really not much, background, and then suddenly, they're a $15 billion company. So I think trends like this are really, fueling demand for electrification right across the board, and I think that's, really positive, and it's only a good thing for both the city and our air quality in the cities, but also for greenhouse gas emission as well.